She woke up, sounding Chinese. She had never left England. What her brain did next changes what we think we know about language. In 2010, a 35-year-old woman named Sarah Colwill went to a hospital in Plymouth, England, after a severe migraine. She had lived her entire life in Devon. She spoke with the thick, rounded vowels of a West Country accent, the kind of voice that placed her immediately, unmistakably, on the English map. She woke up sounding Chinese, not vaguely different, not slightly altered. To everyone around her, her speech carried the tonal rhythm and inflection of a Mandarin speaker. She had never been to China. She had never studied the language. She had never even spent significant time around Chinese speakers. And yet her voice, from that day forward, was simply no longer hers. Sarah was eventually diagnosed with foreign accent syndrome, a rare neurological condition. But that diagnosis, as precise and medical as it sounds, raises more questions than it answers, because cases like hers sit at an uncomfortable crossroads between neuroscience, linguistics, psychology, and something stranger still. Today, we are looking at 3 genuinely different frameworks for understanding what happened to Sarah and to others like her. And each one of them says something profound about what language actually is and where the self lives inside it. Perspective 1. The neuroscience explanation. Start with the most established explanation, and it goes something like this. Language is a physical act. Every word you say is the result of a precise, coordinated sequence of muscle movements. Your tongue, your lips, your jaw, the muscles of your larynx, all firing in patterns your brain has rehearsed since childhood. Those patterns are encoded in specific regions of the brain, particularly in areas like Broca's area in the left frontal lobe, the premotor cortex, the motor cortex, and the basal ganglia. The cerebellum, which coordinates timing and rhythm in movement, also plays a critical role. When a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, or even a severe migraine disrupts those regions, the motor programs for speech can be scrambled. Vowels get tensed or distorted. The natural rhythm of speech, what linguists call prosody, the rise and fall and timing of syllables, shifts in unexpected directions. A stress-timed language like English, where stressed syllables carry weight and unstressed ones compress, can begin to sound syllable-timed, where each syllable is given more equal duration. That shift alone, to a listener's ear, is one of the most powerful signals of a foreign accent. As Professor Nick Miller of Newcastle University, an expert in motor speech disorders, has explained, the so-called foreign accent is, in his words, something in the ear of the listener, rather than the mouth of the speaker. The brain does not produce a Chinese accent. It produces damaged speech. The listener, drawing on what they know of the world's accents, finds the nearest match. Sarah did not become Chinese. Her brain lost its familiar motor programs for the sounds of English, and what emerged sounded, to everyone around her, like something from far away. Neurologists point out something critical here. In every verified case of foreign accent syndrome, patients do not gain actual fluency in any new language. They do not speak foreign words. They do not access vocabulary they never had. The Wikipedia entry for foreign accent syndrome states plainly, there has been no verified case where a patient's foreign language skills have improved after a brain injury. This is a motor disorder, a disorder of physical coordination in the mouth, not a mystery of memory or the soul. What makes this explanation compelling is its precision. MRI scans of FAS patients consistently show damage in predictable areas. The symptoms are linguistically analyzable as patterns of vowel distortion, altered stress, and rhythm change. The condition often improves with speech therapy, just as other motor speech disorders do. The brain was injured, and the injury shows up in the voice. But there is an honest tension here that neuroscience itself has not fully resolved. A subset of FAS cases involves no detectable structural brain damage at all. These are classified as psychogenic, meaning the accent change appears to arise from psychological causes, not physical lesions. In Psychogenic FAS, reviewed in a 2016 paper, researchers found that the pattern of accent change is nearly identical to neurogenic cases, but the cause is rooted in dissociation, trauma, or psychiatric conditions. The brain, in other words, can produce the same speech disruption for emotional reasons as for physical ones, which opens the door to a different set of questions. If this kind of exploration resonates with you, subscribing means you won't miss what we look at next. Perspective 2, the linguist's view, Cryptomnesia and hidden language memory. Now here is where the thinking shifts, particularly when we move from foreign accent syndrome into its stranger cousin, the phenomenon researchers call xenoglossy. The word itself comes from the Greek, xeno, meaning foreign, and glossa, meaning tongue. Xenoglossy is the reported ability to speak an entirely unknown language, not with an unfamiliar accent, but with actual words, grammar, and comprehension, without any apparent opportunity to have learned it. The most rigorously documented case in academic literature comes from Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, who spent decades investigating reports of past life memory and anomalous human experience. In 1970, a Methodist minister named Carol J. hypnotized his wife, Dolores, to try to relieve a backache. While she was under, he asked her a simple question. She answered unexpectedly in German. She said, "Nein." No, Carol did not speak German. He hypnotized her again. This time, a personality emerged who identified herself as Gretchen Gottlieb, a young Catholic woman from 19th century Germany. Over months of sessions, Dolores J., who had spent her whole life in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and had never formally studied German, conversed in that language with native speakers. Stevenson spent approximately 25 hours interviewing the J's, transcribed 19 taped sessions into 346 pages of transcript, and verified with local historians that Dolores had no access to German instruction in any school she attended. This is exactly the kind of case that splits researchers. The linguist Sarah Thomason of the University of Michigan analyzed Gretchen's German in a detailed 1995 paper and reached a skeptical conclusion. Gretchen's vocabulary was minimal, perhaps 237 unique words uttered before any German was spoken to her. Her grammar was often wrong. She rarely produced sentences longer than 5 words. Many of her responses, Thomason argued, were simply repetitions of the interviewer's question or contextual guesses based on yes or no framing. Thomason's explanation draws on a well-documented psychological phenomenon called cryptomnesia, which is the process by which memories a person has genuinely forgotten can return to consciousness in a form that feels original or spontaneous. A person might have heard German spoken once as a child, absorbed isolated words and rhythms without conscious intention, and filed them away in a part of memory completely inaccessible to normal recall. Under hypnosis, under altered states, those buried fragments can surface. The person has no experience of learning the language, but some trace of it was always there, waiting. This explanation is honest about one key difficulty. Cryptomnesia works well for scattered words and phrases. It struggles to explain cases where individuals demonstrate actual conversational responsiveness, answering questions they couldn't predict in a language they could not have encountered. Stevenson's response to Thomason's critique pointed out that while Gretchen's German was imperfect, almost anyone might pick up a few scattered words through indirect exposure, but not the integrated, responsive quality she demonstrated. The debate between them was never fully resolved, and that unresolved quality is itself worth sitting with. Perspective 3. The consciousness and identity question. Both of the previous perspectives, the neurological and the linguistic, are fundamentally about mechanism. They ask, what is the brain doing? But there is a third line of inquiry, one that comes from philosophers of mind, from consciousness researchers, and from people who have lived inside these experiences. And it asks a different question entirely. Not what the brain is doing, but what these cases reveal about the relationship between language and identity itself. Consider what happened to Astrid L., a 30-year-old Norwegian woman who was struck by shrapnel during the German assault on Norway in 1941. The injury disrupted her speech. She recovered, and from that point forward, she spoke with what everyone around her recognized as a German accent. Nazi-occupied Norway was not a place where sounding German was simply inconvenient. She was shunned by her neighbors. She carried the acoustic signature of the enemy in her own voice, through no choice of her own, for the rest of her life. Astrid's tragedy points to something the neuroscience explanation, while accurate on its own terms, does not fully capture. Your voice is not merely a sound. It is a declaration of who you are, where you come from, and who you belong to. When Sarah Colwill says, as she has said publicly, that she feels she has lost her identity, she is not being metaphorical. The voice is one of the most intimate signatures of self that we possess. Researchers who study the psychogenic variant of foreign accent syndrome have begun to argue, as in a 2025 paper in Science Direct, that in some cases the accent change may be secondary to an underlying disruption in the patient's sense of group identity. The brain, under certain psychological conditions, may reach for a different vocal persona because the original one has become associated with trauma, threat, or unbearable pressure. The voice changes not because the motor cortex was lesioned, but because, at some deep level, the self reached for distance from itself. This brings us to the philosophers. David Chalmers, in his work on the hard problem of consciousness, asks why any physical process in the brain should produce subjective experience at all. The neuroscience of speech explains the motor mechanics beautifully. It does not explain why losing an accent feels, to the person living it, like losing a piece of who they are. It does not explain why Dolores J., emerging from hypnosis, in which she spoke as Gretchen, experienced Gretchen's presence in her waking life as something real, as a person beckoning her, grieving, in need. Whether you frame these experiences through neuroscience, through the psychology of hidden memory, or through the harder philosophical question of where identity lives, these cases force a confrontation with something we normally take for granted. The voice feels like ours. It feels continuous, stable, deeply personal. And yet it is, in one sense, simply a set of motor programs running in 3 pounds of tissue. What happens when that tissue changes? What happens when the programs fail? What remains? Conclusion. So let's come back to Sarah Colwill. Standing in her kitchen in Plymouth, speaking in a voice she does not recognize as her own. 15 years after a migraine rewrote her speech, the neurologist looks at her and sees motor speech disruption. Broca's area, the premotor cortex, the precise coordination of vowels and prosody, altered beyond her control. The diagnosis is real, the mechanism is understood, and speech therapy offers partial relief. The linguist looks at these cases and reminds us that language is not magic. Memory is vast, mostly hidden, and capable of surfaces we do not expect. What feels like a mystery may often be an artifact of what the brain stores without asking our permission, and the philosopher and the patient ask something harder. What is a voice? What is a self, if it can be rewritten by a lesion, or surfaced under hypnosis, or disrupted by a trauma the body experienced before the mind could name it? These 3 frameworks are not necessarily in conflict. They may each be true on different levels of the same phenomenon. The brain is the mechanism. The memory is the content. And the self is the one left wondering who is speaking when the familiar voice goes quiet. I'd love to know which of these perspectives resonates most with you.